Welcome back to the WinShape Marriage podcast. I'm your host, Rob Philo. Now we know Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and we hope you're at home preparing for a day of fun, food, and family. And we also know that Thanksgiving is a day to reflect on how thankful and grateful we are. But as a marriage ministry, we think that thankfulness and gratitude extend far beyond just Thanksgiving. And so in today's episode, I'll be talking with Genee Francis, WinShape Marriage team member, about how couples can incorporate gratitude and thankfulness into a regular rhythm within their relationship. It's going to be a great conversation, so let's go ahead and jump in. Genee Francis, welcome to the WinShape Marriage podcast. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Genee, you've been a team member on our WinShape Marriage team for a couple of months now.
Yes.
For our listeners, could you talk a little bit about your role?
Sure. Well, Rob, I have been with the foundation for the past 5 years, and I am new to the marriage team, but not new to the marriage space. I am a licensed professional counselor, so I've worked with couples and families for the past 16, 17 years. But on this team, I am serving as the Assistant Director of Content and Programming.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So today, this episode is coming out right before Thanksgiving. And so it feels fitting to talk a little bit about gratitude and appreciation, specifically in the context of marriage.
Yes.
And Genee, I'm curious if you had this experience growing up, but when I was thinking about gratitude and kind of how I think about gratitude, I thought back to when I was a kid and I would ask my parents, like, hey, can I go over to a friend's house? And they would always give me this one particular instruction, which is always like, make sure you say thank you.
Oh, yeah, for
sure.
sure.
So for me, I think as a kid, at least, I started to associate a lot of gratitude as just making sure you say thank you a lot.
Sure.
And so you'd go over to a friend's house and you'd be like, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yes.
And I think if you don't pick up on it, you can start to think like gratitude is just saying thank you.
That's right.
And I'm curious, when we talk about gratitude, what is the difference between just saying thank you a lot and truly being grateful?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I think most of us had that same experience. And so it's all about the thank you, and don't forget to say thank you. But I think thank you it's a beautiful part of a gratitude mindset, but it is just one element. And Gottman breaks down a culture of gratitude is the language that he uses, and talks about that including appreciation, admiration, and fondness. And so it's just all of those things that are combined that create this culture of gratitude. So when I think about a culture of gratitude versus just saying thank you, I think about it's a mindset shift. It's a heart posture. And I think about it's just a constant flow of appreciation. It's also a constant flow of acknowledgement. And that becomes woven into the marriage relationship. And so it is the foundation of our thoughts. It's the foundation of our perceptions. It becomes really what we base our interactions on.
Yeah.
So it's not just words, but it becomes who we are.
Yeah. It almost sounds like thank you is just a small piece of the larger picture of gratitude. You talked about this piece from Gottman. You said fondness, appreciation. Could you talk a little bit more about what those things mean?
Sure. So when I think of fondness, appreciation, and admiration, we think of the fondness. And so that's the opportunity to just be kind of attracted to and just appreciative of, the things that are going on that we see. I think about admiration as more or less like I admire, or maybe some of the compliments that we use in our relationships. And then appreciation is that thanks. So it's the compliments, the thanks, it's the attraction, it's all the things woven together that we want to make sure we make mention of. I think he says you want to scan the environment to notice. And so if we're noticing things that we can compliment, if we're noticing things that we admire, things that we're fond of, then it becomes, again, just the fiber of our relationship. It becomes built into the fiber of our relationship to where we can really just make our spouses feel known and seen and understood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It feels a little bit tricky because when you think of like, how can I improve gratitude? It feels really easy to say thank you a lot more.
Sure.
But like this picture of like, how can I be more fond of your spouse? Is a little bit of an interesting thought experiment. So do you have any advice or wisdom that you could share there?
Yeah, I think it's personal, and I think it's a personal commitment. And I may just share just some things that have really helped me along the way with this topic. I think it's so important to, first of all, just really notice, like, what is it about your spouse and how do they receive thank you? How do they receive gratitude?
Yeah.
And I think that's an important element of just understanding who they are as a person. And so my word, thank you, may mean the world to my spouse.
Yeah.
But then my acts of kindness that follow may mean more. So just learning how to become almost an expert of your spouse's, we talk about love language, but their gratitude language and what that really looks like.
Yeah. So it sounds like, having a radar for things that you can be on the lookout and be appreciative of, but then also having a radar to understand, like, this is how my spouse is receiving appreciation, which
this is
really
how they're
interesting.
receiving it. Yeah. I think sometimes there are things that we may need to say to ourselves. And so I'm really big on affirmation and just developing like a personal model around gratitude. So one of my personal models that works for me and something that I tried, there's this song, and I'm always speaking in terms of music, but there's this song that our choir, when I was growing up, they used to sing, and it was, the words were just, every day is a day of Thanksgiving. And so, and the song goes on to say, God has been so good to me. Every day he's blessing me. And so when I think of my spouse, I've almost applied those lyrics to him. And so I think every day, not just around Thanksgiving, but every day is a day of Thanksgiving. And he's so good to me.
Yeah.
And so I want to give that back in some way. There's also a sign that I have in my home that helps me to remember that I want to practice a culture of gratitude. And that sign is just basically 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. So it's really just be joyful in all things, right? Pray continually. And then the final one says, give thanks in all things. And so it's just kind of a summary of that scripture. But I have that in my kitchen, and it just sits there. And it's something that not only I can see, but our whole house can see. And it really helps me to make the adjustment of my posture when needed.
Yeah. It sounds like you're being super intentional about how to think about your spouse, like the story you're telling yourself about your spouse a little bit. And then also being super intentional about making sure you have a heart of gratitude by inviting those pieces of wisdom in.
Sure.
I want to dig in a little bit on this idea of how you think about your spouse and how your spouse thinks about themselves and how gratitude can help encourage them in that. I think about how every spouse, like every husband, wants to be a good husband.
Sure.
But they might not necessarily believe that they're a good husband. And I think through gratitude, it really opens the door to help your spouse tell a different story about themselves that they might not necessarily think before. Could you talk a little bit about how in marriage we can support one another and help ourselves tell better stories about who we are?
Sure. I think sometimes in marriage, we don't have a blueprint. And so oftentimes we're going through life and we don't really know, how we're doing in this thing. Like we're doing the best we can with what we know, right? The tools that we enter in. And so I think sometimes we can use this culture of gratitude or even just the opportunity to celebrate our spouse to kind of help them keep a pulse on how things are going. But sometimes, we're moving about, the logistics of day to day and kids and balancing work and all the things. Sometimes it's hard to really know, where do I sit in my spouse's eyes and what are the things that I could be doing differently? And I think that showing gratitude and saying thank you and I appreciate you. And that little thing you did yesterday made all the difference and really brightened my day. That there's this reciprocity effect that happens. So even if my spouse is not feeling that or thinking that or in that same space or maybe even feeling a little insecure, those words could completely change their outlook. It could change how they're feeling about in their interactions with you and just help them to know that like, I'm on the right track and this is, this is good.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you think about the context of how your spouse or even yourself goes throughout day to day, like you have work, you have long days, you deal with kids. And so it's easy to feel beat down and like,
that's right.
Man, I really could use some encouragement. And so it feels like stepping in and offering those words of encouragement can really make the biggest difference for your spouse.
Absolutely.
You talked a little bit about tangible ways that we can go about living out this lifestyle of gratitude and appreciation in marriage.
Yeah.
How can we like real practically go in and say like, I'm going to be a better spouse when it comes to appreciation?
Absolutely. So, you could absolutely look at like the thank yous. And so some of the verbal acknowledgement, I think that goes a long way. But in addition to that, it's the written thank you notes. It's the written notes of appreciation that are really special and meaningful, especially, it's kind of like when you find one in your lunch or you find one written on the mirror. Me and this mic.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
When you find something written on the mirror, or just there's so many different ways that we can implement like writing notes.
Yeah.
Special dinners or surprise dates, I think is a great way to show appreciation. I think the way that you talk about your spouse in their presence and outside of their presence to other people is huge. And so I think that not missing those opportunities to do those little things here and there to be able to show like, I appreciate you, I thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the idea of like a surprise dinner or something like that, because there's the acknowledgement piece and then the gratitude piece. It's like, hey, you could say, hey, you've done a really great job with the kids this week. I really appreciate it. I want to take you out to dinner.
Sure.
And that's just a really heartwarming way of saying thank you for everything that you're doing. So those are some tangible ways, but I feel like sometimes it can feel like when life gets busy and your calendar starts filling up, you can have all these good intentions of like, I'm going to be super proactive and say thank you and take my spouse on dates. And then as soon as like your kid has a soccer game, it's easy for that to just kind of fly out the window.
That's right. And
I think one of the most effective tools that we have in marriage is setting up routines and systems of gratitude.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about how couples can do that?
Absolutely. I think one of the things before even talking about a routine is just really creating habits around just saying thank you, and not. I think sometimes when we think of thank you and gratitude, we think about big things. But as we are shuffling around in the morning, and we're going through the morning routine, and your husband happens to just start breakfast while you're combing hair, for example, just the thank you for that, just right there in that moment is so key. I think also daily gratitude check-ins. And so I'm a huge proponent. I don't think that there's a day that should go by without couples doing a check-in. And if that check-in is 10 minutes, if that check-in is an hour, but incorporating gratitude in that daily check-in. I think we can often get caught up with logistics and planning and making sure the calendar is tight.
Yeah.
But also making room to say, hey, how are you? Are you doing okay? Or, you know what? Hey, I appreciate the way that you did X, Y, and Z. Being very specific in the way that we show our thanks.
Yeah.
I think gratitude journaling is an excellent practice. And if you can somehow carry that into your marriage, and even if it's not a daily thing that you share, but on a weekly basis, even just being able and being very intentional to share gratitude and kind of just ping pong it back and forth.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit? This is kind of the first time I'm hearing about this idea of gratitude journaling. What does that look like real practically?
Yeah, practically. So it could be like a notebook that you have. Some people have a really pretty journal. Some people do gratitude journaling in their phone, but literally pulling out some kind of device or some paper and just writing, today I am grateful for.
Yeah. It's
a great exercise, especially for people who are struggling in a season, or if they are dealing with mood issues, or if they're dealing with grief and loss. Sometimes it's hard to find something to be grateful for.
Yeah.
And we can easily say like, I don't have anything to be grateful for. Like everything sucks, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we can always, if it literally is, thank you for the breath in my body, we can always find something to be grateful for. And I have found, even in my marriage and with my spouse, I can always find something to say thank you for.
Yeah. And so when you're doing this gratitude journal, if you have something that you write down about your spouse, is it just you share the journal entry for that day, or kind of how does that?
Well, you could. Yeah. Absolutely. And, a lot of times people are like, where do I start? And it's like, okay, find 3 things, right? That are things that you want to note for just like, I'm super grateful for these things today. And so again, you may have something to share every day. You may not. But if you stop for a moment and pause and think, there should be at least one thing that you can be able to say, hey, I'm grateful for you today because of this.
Yeah. And I think that really speaks to this element of when we think about showing appreciation and gratitude in marriage, not only does it uplift your spouse,
That's right.
but it also gives you a fresh perspective on all of the things that you can be grateful for.
Absolutely.
And I think about the lens that you see your spouse through.
Sure.
If you were to go through and do something like a gratitude journal and just write down like, God, thank you for giving me a spouse this morning.
Sure.
Or God, thank you for the way my spouse made breakfast this morning.
That's right.
And if you can really focus in on all those small things that you might brush over in a normal day and not even realize it, it sounds like that would really change your heart posture and give you a lot of joy as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's contagious.
No, it is contagious.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this idea of it being contagious. Because we know like in marriage, there are good seasons and sometimes there are tough seasons. And I think one of the pieces of advice that's been helpful for me is someone shared with me one time, the culture of gratitude that you build up in your marriage is kind of like your immune system for when things get tough. And so when you and your spouse are sideways or maybe in a position where you're not on the best terms, a lot of the equity that you build up in your relationship through showing gratitude and appreciation can really help mitigate some of those feelings of maybe not being on the same page.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about the impact gratitude has in those circumstances?
Absolutely. I love the analogy that you used about the immune system. I think of it too as a thermostat, right? And so you set the thermostat regardless of how the temperature rises or falls. It literally becomes that it's just like it's like a safe barrier that is in place so that regardless if we have to have difficult conversations or if we're celebrating, we have a contained, safe space where we can do that because we've produced this environment where we celebrate each other, we love each other, we affirm each other, we appreciate each other constantly. That's woven into the fabric of our relationship. And so because of that, we're able to have difficult moments, difficult seasons, but we can overcome it because we don't have to allow life or the situation or the challenge to change our thermostat. It may change our temperature.
Yeah. And I think there's a piece of research, and I think it's from Gottman. He talks about this idea of like a golden ratio, like having a certain amount of appreciation and gratitude
5
for
to
every.
1, I think.
Is it 5 to 1?
Absolutely.
And so making sure that you really lean into that appreciation so that you don't get out of whack.
Sure.
Because you could very easily get to a place where it feels like, man, we're just criticizing, we're just tearing each other down, you know?
Absolutely.
And if you don't have that positive side to balance things out, it can very quickly feel like, oh, we're just in a season of negativity.
That's
it feels
right.
like.
That's right. That's right.
When we talk about the topic of gratitude, what are some signs for couples to be on the lookout for? Say like, hey, we haven't been paying attention to this, but we really need to be more intentional about being appreciative in our relationship.
Absolutely. I think when you begin to feel disconnected, it's a good sign. When there's constant discord or negativity, to your point, and you feel like the conversations or the temperatures just become a little bit more negative consistently. The other thing I think you can really look at if you have children is watch your children. You know, a lot of times ungrateful children are a sign that I'm not showing appreciation and thanks. I'm not really living out this culture of gratitude. And guess everything we do comes out in our children. Yeah. So I think that's a huge, huge way, a huge indicator of where we are in this thing. Yeah.
Because ultimately, I guess your kids will pick up on what they see from you.
Absolutely.
And so if you're living out a way that's not appreciative and your kids aren't, then it's like, okay, I really need to go back and check myself a little bit.
You know, something else I think about too is defeated speech, you know, and so a defeated posture. So if you notice all of a sudden that your spouse is kind of hard on themselves or talking down on themselves, or maybe they just seem literally just a little bit more defeated in the way that they're showing up, I think that's also an indicator because, again, we have an opportunity to speak life through gratitude. And so when you notice that on top of everything else, I think it's a huge indicator that we need to probably look at how well we're celebrating each other.
That's a really interesting point. So like if you hear your spouse saying like, man, I really didn't do good at work today, or man, I really messed up with the kids or whatever, tucking that away in the back of your brain and saying like, this is an opportunity for me to speak into that and speak uplifting words to them so that they have a little bit more confidence in that. You talked a little bit about this idea of your kids modeling what they see from you.
Absolutely.
And I think any parent listening to this podcast would want to know, like, what does it mean to model gratitude to your kids? What are some ways that we can actually go about doing that?
Yeah. Our kids are always watching the interaction between their parents.
Yeah.
And it's so funny, your kids get to a certain age, they can almost explain the dynamic better than you can. And I know personally for us, it almost becomes a running joke. But one of the things, and I'll give an example, I cook most days.
Yeah.
And my husband almost always, but I'll say often, says, thank you, honey, for this meal. Or he'll say something that just says, you know what, I appreciate you doing that. And so what I've noticed is my oldest son in particular now says, Mom, thank you for dinner. Or, Mom, I appreciate this.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't doing that, but I'm 100% sure it's because of the example of his father.
Yeah.
So our kids are always watching. And so I think just being very intentional in how we're relating with one another, how we're relating to them, because they're little people, they're little humans that God has blessed us to steward. We don't want to miss opportunities with them to say thank you. And I appreciate you. And I really love the way that you did X, Y, and Z. And thank you for helping Mommy with X, Y, and Z. I think it's so important to do that. So
it sounds like if they're like doing chores or something and they're done, and you say, oh, thank you so much for doing that. That was a huge help or something like that. Yeah,
absolutely. Not omitting those opportunities, because I think, again, we can just almost feel like they're supposed to do these things because they're their chores and their kids, and we're all contributors. But I think even including them in this whole culture, and I think there's just a lot of opportunity for parents.
Yeah.
The music we listen to.
Oh, that's interesting.
Absolutely. So I think playlists that are specifically designed towards thankfulness, gratitude is so important, because that begins to penetrate through their little hearts and their little minds and their little bodies. And I think that those words stay with them as well.
That's interesting. Okay. So you're saying going through and being intentional about picking up and putting together a playlist with intentional music?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
It will change the atmosphere of your home.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's really cool. I mean, it makes sense because it's part of the environment of your family.
Absolutely.
And so if you can alter one small piece of that environment, it makes sense that would have an impact.
Absolutely.
But, I want to jump back into one of these things that we discussed earlier on in this conversation that I thought was super interesting. And it was this idea of spouses receiving appreciation slightly differently.
Sure.
Do you think that's true, that some spouses receive appreciation in different ways? And
Absolutely.
If so, how can couples go about addressing that?
Absolutely. The way that we give and receive is based on our prior experiences, is also largely based on our family of origin. So if we grow up in environments where there isn't this culture of appreciation, or if we grow up in environments where people aren't comfortable using their words to express their feelings, then we can come into marriage without those skills and those tools. And so whereas I may feel grateful, extremely thankful every day, I may not have the ability to speak it. And so being able to have those open and honest conversations as a couple and really working through and the love languages exercise is so great, because you literally can take a quiz and then you could use that as a foundation to begin to discuss, what does that really mean? And so I think the same thing applies with thanks. Again, me saying thank you may go a long way, but an act of service may show thank you much larger than my words. And so really learning and becoming an expert of how your spouse receives it. And then also being accepting of the difference. Because sometimes it's hard for people to wrap their minds around well, I love words. And so I'm going to give words. But it's really not about you. Really, it's about your spouse. And so how can I lean into their need when it comes to this topic?
Yeah. So it sounds like the love languages are a great compass to go back and look and see, okay, here's how they receive love, but also how they receive appreciation.
Absolutely.
And I do think that's such a good guide, because as we talked about the different practical and tangible ways that you can show gratitude, if your spouse's love language is words of appreciation, saying thank you or writing a note might be the best thing in the world. Versus if it's gifts or acts of service, you might show that in a slightly different way. So I think that's really interesting. For the couples listening to this episode, maybe they're at this point and they're wondering, man, this has been such an encouraging episode. But what's one piece of advice or one last thought that you want them to hear as we close this conversation today?
Absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind for me is that it's never too late to adopt this culture. So whether you've been married 6 months, 6 years, 25 years, right? You can always make the shift. And the best way to do that is to be intentional. Have the conversation with your spouse. Let them know what's on your heart. And work together on how do we create this. And you don't have to be even on the same page. So if you're in a space and your spouse is in a different space, again, because of the reciprocity factor of this behavior being contagious, you just start. Be encouraged. Just start, and then it will catch. And you can bet that you'll begin to see even small glimpses of gratitude to be able to penetrate through your home and through your family.
Yeah, that's such an encouraging perspective, this idea that you don't have to both be on the same page here. Like, there's that one saying, it's like, if you want to change your marriage, draw a circle around yourself and change anyone inside the circle.
Be the change.
Yeah, and so it sounds like even just as you as an individual going into your marriage and saying, I'm going to make it a habit to be grateful.
Yes.
And then you can slowly start to see how that will impact not just yourself, but also how your spouse slowly will reciprocate that.
Absolutely.
It sounds like. Well, Genee, thank you so much for your time today. We're so thankful to have you on the podcast. And to those listening, thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of the WinShape Marriage podcast. We'll be back here next week.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this conversation, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more marriage resources. And let us know what you think of this episode in the comments below.